Welcome to the Modise Network. The high-profile arrests of individuals alleged to have been involved in corruption ignited hope that the turning of the tide had begun. The arrest of the chairperson of the Home Affairs Portfolio Committee, Bongani Bongo, by the Hawks led the Democratic Alliance to remind the nation that they had laid the original charges. Elsewhere, the courts had ruled that assets of the regiment's capital be untouched. Liquidators were preparing to auction the Gupta compound, and the National Prosecuting Authority announced that it was ready to prosecute the Estina dairy matter. Many NGOs, including the organization Undoing Tax Abuse, had repeatedly and for years been reporting cases of corruption without any response from the crime-fighting agencies. Into the mix, it now emerges that at Eskom, some of the major private companies involved in the controversial Kusile and Medupi projects had established a fund to bribe officials who allowed costs to escalate. Pieter-Louis Myburgh of Skopje Daily Maverick investigated the story, and Rudie Heyneke from OUTA will join him to discuss the significance of these developments. Later in the show, we will explore a concept called instructional leadership, which apparently has contributed to improvements in the management and performance of schools in the Free State province. We'll end the show with a discussion on the various successes in the ongoing efforts to reduce HIV/AIDS impact on individuals and society. Dr. Julia Turner will join us for that, but first we ask, is the tide turning against the perpetrators of corruption? I'm now joined by Pieter-Louis Myburgh and Rudie Heyneke of the organization Undoing Tax Abuse. And we're inviting you to join the network with your comments using the hashtag the Modise Network. And welcome to you, Pieter-Louis. And Rudie, pleasure to have you on the show. And I suppose one could regard it as some sort of victory or vindication, if you will, Pieter-Louis, the fact that then Tim Modise, the doctor, from Prasa, has been ordered by the courts to repay 5.7 million rands. How did you feel? What did you think when you read about
I think, Tim, thanks for having me. I think there is some vindication in that. Obviously, I've been working on Prasa matters for a good 4 years, since 2015, and some of that involved with Tim Modise. And for many years, Journalists Association and stuff, we've been asking, where's the accountability? And it wasn't forthcoming. So at least in this instance, it's in civil cases where the likes of Tim Modise are making or having to pay for their state capture or corruption sins. In his case, he has to pay back some of the money. Obviously, we've also lately seen Lucky Montana having a bit of a battle with SARS, where there's some recoverables, some outstanding tax fees that's being recouped from him, and they're seizing some of his assets. So on the civil front, yes, there's a bit of movement, and that certainly does.
But how do you feel as an individual? Obviously, then when you make the revelations about the qualifications and about wrongdoing, the accountability issues, you came under personal attacks, right? And I suppose at some point you might even have doubted your story and the reporting.
Sure.
And because people were questioning your motives at that time.
Yeah, look, I think investigative journalism is always based on solid facts and documentation, so there's not really much doubt, but it does become a frustrating situation where a large portion of the public and on social media, there are these accusations flung at us. We're fabricating facts and all sorts of other ulteriors. We're racist, or we're serving a certain agenda or an anti-Lucky Montana agenda. So when, there's confirmation by means of SARS stepping in, or hopefully later the NPA, that really is a bit of vindication and some comfort.
And Rudie, your organization has also been very much involved in exposing some of the corruption, and it's taken some time. I think at some point you probably felt like you were whistling in the wind, so to speak, because you talk, people say, show us the evidence. You can't confirm, verify it. You can merely lodge cases with the authorities, and not much action was taking place. Following what happened this past week with the high-profile arrests of at least one member of parliament and former security minister Bongo, that people felt like things were beginning to turn around. Is that the sense that you're having now?
Yes, absolutely, Tim. I think that this arrest of the ex-minister is something positive, and we are working nowadays very closely with the NPA and the newly established Investigative Directorate producing what we could retrieve from the Gupta leaks to them. 2-3 years of work that we can, produce to the law enforcement agencies now. And the sense that we got there as well is that, they are moving forward as a civil society working group. We had a meeting with Advocate Cronje yesterday. And it was a very good and robust conversation. And she assured us that when arrests come and when charges are laid against people, that they must be able, NPA will be able to hand over the docket, so that there will not be postponement on postponement, and that they can go on and carry on with the cases.
Well, you say you had a meeting with Ms. Cronje, who's with the NPA, right, as civil society organizations.
Yes.
Well, what do you mean? How many of you were there, and why are you working closely with it? Is it something that's happening for the first time, for that matter?
This civil society working group, we are 21 civil society organizations that came together more than a year ago, just more than a year ago, and said that we as a collective are going to make submissions to the Zondo Commission. That work has been done. We will make a big submission at the beginning of next year. And there were questions between the members of this working group about the NPA and how they work and do they move forward and what can we expect from them. And the idea was then to invite them and have a one-on-one conversation and hear from the horse's mouth, what is happening. And that is how this came about.
What was the experience previously? Is this something new, or this is how you've always worked with NPA?
Previously, we laid complaints at the South African Police Service way back in 2017, what we could retrieve and what we could find in the Gupta leaks. It was a very quiet period up until the establishment of the ID, and then we changed our tactics. And we said we would rather go, in terms of Section 27 of the NPA Act, make referrals to the NPA straight away and cut out the investigation of the police service. And that is bearing fruit at this stage. We are working closely together and we do provide them with a lot of information.
Now, Pieter-Louis, you have, as I said, come under attack personally, but you're not the only one. There are other journalists, investigative journalists, who've been trying to uncover the instances of corruption. But the impression that members of the public, some of them in South Africa, have is that you seem to be trying to embarrass those who are in the political system or the public sector the most. But it's been how many years that you've been working on different cases? You've even published the book Gangster State out of that. So, just tell me about your experience and share with us the experience of fellow investigative journalists as you are trying to tell the story of the damage that was being caused by corruption to our society.
Yeah, certainly. Tim, I think firstly, it's very important to tackle the issue of where this criticism comes from, and mostly it emanates from those implicated in the corruption revelations. It's a complete misperception to say that we only focus on state corruption or public sector officials. There's always an interplay between private sector entities and companies and individuals and the state sector. The phenomenon of state capture cannot function in any other way. There's a private sector beneficiary and there's a accomplice somewhere in the public sector, and we always expose both of them on an equal footing. That being said, there's this expression, the highest trees catch the most wind. So prominent political figures by default are going to catch a lot of flack when we become involved in these issues, foremost because they swear an oath to uphold the Constitution and to not only serve their own private interests and become involved in these kind of dubious shenanigans. So having said that, over the last couple of years, certainly having played a role in exposing some of these corrupt deals, some of these state capture networks, it's been at some point a very frustrating sort of endeavor because of the fact that, I think sort of like week after week or month after month, and certainly not only myself, the great work from my colleagues at Scorpio too, at Amabungani, at some of the Sunday newspapers, on an ongoing basis, we very clearly expose some of these clear cases of egregious behavior and corruption and malfeasance. And there was just, especially circa 2015, 2016, this kind of high point of state capture, we'd expose the corrupt dealings, and then there's this absolute silence on behalf of the National Prosecuting Authority and the Hawks. So they would at least say that they're looking into these cases, but then 2, 3, 4 years later, we'd see no movement on some of these cases. PROSA is a case in point. Been very clear cases of corrupt deals. We don't even have to say allegedly corrupt anymore. There's been court pronouncements. Tuli Madonsela, the former public protector, very clearly labeled the wrongdoings in the procurement environment at PROSA, highlighting obviously corrupt deals, and despite that mounting, body of evidence, we never saw the prosecutions year after year after year, despite these promises from the NPA.
What's your view of the Zondo Commission? I've heard sentiments being expressed that it is becoming one big yawn.
Sure.
Boring spectacle, right?
Yes.
That it started with a bit of fireworks. People were thinking that a lot of information that is exposed there would lead to investigations, arrests, prosecutions, and nothing has happened. And therefore, I think there's some Zondo Commission fatigue, if you will, that is setting in. But do you think it's serving any purpose whatsoever? I mean, obviously people who follow these things and have a memory to remember that this was said 3 years ago, and then connecting the dots, as it were. I find it still very interesting, but others feel that it has not really yielded the results.
Absolutely, Tim. Look, I can understand the Zondo Commission fatigue and skepticism. We've got a history of having cause for being wary about commissions of inquiry. The Rudie Commission really was a farce and didn't get to the bottom of the arms deal. When the Zondo Commission came around, and as a journalist who's kind of been working on some of the issues that's being aired at the Zondo Commission, it certainly is something that I believe myself and a lot of my colleagues were very positive about. I think they've finally, while the NPA and the Hawks were kind of sorting out some of their capacity issues, I mentioned earlier on, and while Rudie mentioned earlier on, and while they're trying to get their ducks in a row, at least there was a platform and a place where these kind of issues were going to be unpacked and aired. But I always had a caveat. I always said from the outset that the Zondo Commission is justified, and we know it's costing a lot of money, a good 200 million rand or so. And I said, it's going to cost a good couple of 100 million rand, yes. Yep. And I always said it would be justified if it leads to prosecutions. It cannot, again, lead to even a compelling report and there are no criminal prosecutions. There has been these promises. There are officials or representatives from the NPA and the Hawks sitting in, apparently, at the Zondo Commission, and they would turn the testimony and the evidence and information at the Zondo Commission into prosecutions. Obviously, we haven't seen that yet, but perhaps we require a little bit more patience. I would only be happy about the Zondo Commission if it does lead to prosecution.
Now, Rudie, in your case, you say you have interacted with the NPA. What is the impression you're getting? Because, again, criticisms have been leveled at Advocate Batoy. She's been in the position for about 10 months now, and people feel that there's not much action coming out of there. Do you get a sense that things are going to move somehow, and what are you basing that on?
Yes, definitely. The sense that we have from our side and our interactions with the NPA and the ID, it's very positive, and you can see behind the scenes the movements that's taking place. I think we must also appreciate the fact that investigation of this magnitude is not it's not finished overnight.
All right, we'll pick up the conversation in a moment. We want to hear your comments. Do you think that the tide is turning against corruption in the country? Share your views on social media. The hashtag is the Modise Network. Don't go away.